Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. I was unemployed, this guy scammed me, revenge is still pouring on him. First and foremost, this didn't happen in the US. Some events might be pursuable up there, but down here it was mostly no man's land regarding the kind of scams I fell for. For the sake of this story, here in no man's land we use the top-level domain NML. My wife is a nurse. Back then, in the mid-2010s, she worked in an ICU of a relatively exclusive, and therefore expensive, hospital. Specifically, she had to care for patients that had undergone cardiac surgery. At the same time, I was working for a small tech startup that was going out of business. The founders had run out of funding, we hadn't secured any important contracts lately, and in my country you have to pay for employees' severance, unless you file for bankruptcy. So they decided to shut down while they still had enough cash to pay our severances. One day my wife calls me and tells me about this gentleman in his early 60s that had been on the verge of passing away, and after that close call he was so grateful and effusive. We'll call him Charlie Moreno. This gentleman happened to work in tech imports, which gave him access to incredibly convenient deals. "Hey, you won't believe what happened today," my wife said excitedly over the phone. "What's up?" I asked, curious about her enthusiastic tone. "Remember that patient I told you about, the one who almost didn't make it? Well, he's so grateful he wants to sell us a 4K TV, a store demo unit that's barely been used. We'd only need to pay like 1/4 of its retail price." It caught me off guard. I hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" "He seems genuine," she reassured me. "Plus, he said to keep it quiet because he's risking his relationship with the brand." I was naive, I know. But I thought, being her patient, she knew all personal data from this guy, so it seemed unlikely he would target her for a scam. His father was a known businessman. Now retired and approaching his 90s, Mr. Moreno Sr. was well respected in his community and wouldn't have let his son wreak havoc. Also, my wife had acquaintances in common with Charlie's sister, a known doctor at another hospital. The holiday season was approaching, she asked Charlie, who had been already discharged and back home, for advice regarding the present she wanted to give me, a smartphone. He hooked her up with the best she could think of. Now, I can't remember the exact model, but it was the latest iPhone and it wasn't yet offered by local carriers. He had access to it because of his status as a local representative for said brand. She went with it. Paid. The job position I've said my employer was shutting down, so just for the sake of it, she asked Charlie if he knew of someone needing an IT guy. "Of course," he said. "I'll meet your husband at this place tomorrow, etc." And there I was, in a trendy coffee shop downtown. He pulled over in a Tesla. Mr. Moreno was a normal-looking guy, used a cane, and had a noticeable knee or hip pain. We sat down, and he told me about a mid-management position, reporting to him in a renewable energy company I had barely heard about. "Listen," he said, leaning in conspiratorially, "this company is about to explode. They're on the cutting edge of solar technology. You'd be perfect for their IT department." He coached me on what I should say in the upcoming job interview. We spoke about salary. I was dazzled. "Wait, renewable energy? Didn't you say he was into tech imports?" He was that kind of guy you can't pause to question, because he'd already thrown something extra to the mix, and this position had a better paycheck than the one I was being laid off from. In the next days, we had a few phone calls. Stuff looked promising. I had been already laid off. We agreed he'd pick me up on December 24th, and he'd introduce me to senior managers as the recommended help desk junior manager. I woke up extra early, put on my best suit, waited in the front yard. Hours went by. I had planned to be back before noon to arrange stuff for that night's dinner because my parents were coming over. After calling him repeatedly, he told me he had been assaulted and robbed. "They took my cane and broke it on my knee," he wailed. Poor guy. I told him to forget about my interview for the time being. No, I promised you I'll make it up to you." Of course, since he had been injured, he wasn't able to deliver the items my wife bought from him. That night, my mother asked me about the new job. I could not bring myself to tell her about the delay. I told her it was going fine. That night, I Googled him. Nothing showed up except for some awards in the Imports and Customs Associations of whatever. He called me to reschedule our interview, December 31st. Again, picture me in my best suit outside my house on a summer morning. Of course he didn't show up. When I finally reached him, he tells me that when his car had been stolen last week, they took his wallet too, which these thugs eventually dropped during another robbery, so now he had been detained as a suspect for that. He hadn't been able to pick up the imported electronics from the customs office, so they had them moved to another custody unit where it would take a couple of weeks to retrieve. That night, we went to my parents for New Year's Eve, and my mother asked me about the new job. "It's all fine," I said. I Google him again, this time with variations regarding his name or the supposed company he was setting me into. Not much showed up, nothing shady. The next call was like a week later. He told me that because he was being involved in a police investigation, this renewable energy company had fired him. But this was actually good, because now I was going to be interviewed to take his position as IT manager. This meant double my former paycheck, and securing a position that would be a leap forward in my career, so I don't ask many questions. I was just grateful. All those delays in the end would pay off. This situation, as you have already figured out, went on and on for weeks. My interview never happened. The electronics never arrived. We had lost our money, our time, our holidays, our hopes, and I was still unemployed and hadn't been applying for job offers since I had this one allegedly secured. I texted him, somewhere in between. I texted him, "Why are you doing this to us?" He texted back, "If I wanted to, you have nothing on me, but if you stick with me, you'll be rewarded tenfold." Cue in, the detective time went by. Eventually, my wife overhears from a coworker about this patient in another hospital she was working at. Some nurses do work part-time at other hospitals. She had fallen for it too, but her husband was a detective, so a few hours later we were filling him in on the details of the scam we fell for. Asking around, he found a third nurse scammed by this guy. Soon enough, he was detained, this time for real, and admitted to have been scamming people due to an impromptu invented mild dementia. This detective talks him into an off-court deal in which he gave us back every cent, but not my time nor hopes, in exchange for us not pursuing any legal action. This was a decent deal because us, having failed to make a written agreement on any of these purchases, had at most a weak claim to our money. By the way, the money with which he paid us, he had to borrow from his father and some from his sister, the doctor. Remember, this didn't happen in the US? This agreement is actually completely legal down here. So I made a blog. This part I rewrote to clarify events and consequences in our legal system. I couldn't go for any further legal action, but there wasn't a non-disclosure agreement whatsoever, and I thought, what could prevent other people falling into this scammer's lies? Well, perhaps some Google results? I was in a unique position to tell my story without risking a legal backlash, so I created a blog on WordPress.com. Think something like charliemooreNotTheScammer.wordpress.com. It was a single post in third person telling my story. The site's admin, me, of course, closing words were, "Has it happened to you?" In the following days, that post's comments had a dozen stories much like mine. For each comment that deserved to be a story of its own, with due permission from its author, I turned those into a post with a brief intro. A testimony from Maria from X City. Each one eventually had comments and so on. Since civil action court filings, as opposed to criminal courts, are public in my country, you can dig into ongoing class actions and recent settlements. I found out 5 years later he tried suing the contact for WordPress.ml, our local fictional TLD, on the grounds of undermining existing past and potential activity for the plaintiff. I'd say that part is true. To this day, if you Google for Charlie Moreno, that blog will be the first result. It has been for the last 10 years. The case, of course, was dropped, but he took it to appeals and then to Supreme Court. There is another entry filed under a different local court, promptly dismissed, and whose expedient closes with his lawyer apologizing to Automatic.com for any past or future inconveniences related to this case, and whose verdict rules Charlie Moreno had to pay also for the sued party attorney's fee. There is a third suit. It was filed by his former lawyer, to whom he hadn't paid for the former civil actions. I was tempted then and there to set a post on this blog saying, "If I wanted to, you have nothing on me." However, I have never attempted to let him know who's doing this. And, I feel sorry for him, but every time I consider taking the blog down, I log in again. Today I did, after 3 years. And see, he's still doing it. Those comments I turned into posts, of course. Even knowing that I'm legally covered, the fact that I haven't ever been contacted tells me he's done this to so many people we wouldn't know where to start. All of his victims or scam targets are people in a vulnerable moment of their life, or a rough patch. Unemployed guys, small startups looking for an angel investor, small branch salespeople pursuing a promising commission. Those who have, in time, reached a compensation or agreement, it's because Charlie's now ancient father had to chip in. From what they say, his sister has gone no contact, but it's still the one they go to before suing. Most of the commenters leave their email addresses, and I have known of a few that have teamed with each other and succeeded in legal actions. But even if they hadn't, they have a place to rant, and their rants are still the first result in Google if you look for him. Perhaps this is not a revenge, but it's my story. The next one is an entitled people's story. I've lived in my beachfront house for over 20 years. It's not fancy, but it's home. The best part is the private beach access, a narrow strip of sand leading right down to the water. I love nothing more than sitting out there with a cold drink, watching the waves roll in. That all changed when the Wilsons moved in next door last summer. At first, they seemed nice enough. We exchanged pleasantries over the fence, talked about the weather, pretty standard neighbor stuff, but things took a turn about a month after they arrived. I was heading down to the beach one afternoon when I noticed a couple of lounge chairs set up on my portion of the sand. Figured it must have been an honest mistake, so I moved them over to the Wilsons' side. The next day, the chairs were back, along with an umbrella and a cooler. This time, Mrs. Wilson herself was sprawled out, working on her tan. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my cool. "I think there's been some confusion. This is actually my property." She peered at me over her sunglasses. "Oh, honey, I don't think so. We bought this house specifically for the beach access. Our realtor assured us the property line extends all the way to the water." I blinked, caught off guard by her confidence. "Well, I'm afraid your realtor was mistaken. I've owned this strip for 2 decades. It's clearly marked in my deed." Mrs. Wilson just laughed and waved me off. "Why don't you double-check those property records, dear? I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself." I was steaming as I stormed back to the house. The audacity of this woman. I dug out my deed and property maps, determined to settle this once and for all. But as I pored over the documents, my heart sank. The boundaries weren't nearly as clear-cut as I remembered. The next few weeks were tense. The Wilsons continued using my beach as if they owned it. They even started inviting friends over for cookouts. I felt powerless, unsure of my legal standing. Then one Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine revving. I looked out my bedroom window to see Mr. Wilson on a riding lawnmower, cutting my grass. He had pushed my fence back nearly 10 feet, expanding their yard into what was clearly my property. That was the last straw. I marched outside in my pajamas, screaming for him to stop. Mr. Wilson just grinned and kept mowing. "Bob Wilson, you turn that thing off right now or I swear I'll call the cops." He killed the engine. "Go right ahead. This is our land, plain and simple. We're just reclaiming what's rightfully ours." I was shaking with rage. "You can't just decide where property lines are. There are legal processes for this." "Then I suggest you get a lawyer," he smirked. "Because we've already started the paperwork to have the deeds officially changed." I stood there, slack-jawed, as he fired up the mower and resumed destroying my yard. As soon as he finished, I called my buddy Steve. He's not a property lawyer, but he knows enough to point me in the right direction. Steve came over that afternoon and we went through all my documents with a fine-tooth comb. Turns out the property lines were a bit fuzzy due to some outdated surveying techniques. But Steve was confident that both the beach access and the portion of yard the Wilsons had claimed were solidly mine. "Look," he said, pointing to a clause in the original deed. "This clearly states that your property extends to the mean high tide line. And these old survey markers, they put your back fence right where it was before Wilson moved it." I felt a glimmer of hope. "So what do I do now?" Steve grinned. "Well, you could take them to court, but I've got a better idea. One that'll make them think twice about messing with you again." The next morning, I woke up early and got to work. I rented a bunch of surveying equipment, theodolites, measuring wheels, the works. Then I recruited a few friends to help me put on a show. We spent hours taking measurements, pounding stakes into the ground, and stretching bright orange tape between them. We made sure to be extra noisy, especially when we got close to the Wilsons' house. It didn't take long for Mrs. Wilson to come stomping out. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" I gave her my biggest smile. "Oh, just having the property resurveyed. Gotta make sure those boundaries are accurate, you know." Her face went pale. "You can't do that without notifying us first." "Actually, I can. I'm surveying my own property after all. But don't worry, I'll be sure to provide you with a copy of the results. Wouldn't want there to be any confusion about where your land ends and mine begins." Mr. Wilson joined his wife, looking nervous. "Now, hold on. Let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can work something out between us." I shook my head. "Oh no. I think it's best we let the professionals handle this. In fact, I've already contacted the county assessor's office. They'll be out next week to officially update the records." The Wilsons exchanged a panicked look. They knew they'd been caught. "Listen," Mr. Wilson said, his voice suddenly conciliatory. "We may have been a bit overzealous in our interpretation of the property lines. Why don't we sit down and discuss this like reasonable adults?" I pretended to consider it. "Well, I suppose we could come to an arrangement, on one condition." "Name it," Mrs. Wilson said quickly. "You put my fence back exactly where it was, and you sign a notarized document acknowledging that the beach access belongs to me." They agreed without hesitation. Within a day, my yard was restored, and I had in writing that the beach was mine. The Wilsons even apologized, though I could tell it pained them to do so. These days, things are pretty quiet between us. The Wilsons keep to themselves, and I make a point of enjoying my beach as often as possible. Sometimes I'll catch them watching enviously from their window. When I do, I just smile and wave. It just goes to show, you don't always need lawyers and courtrooms to solve a dispute. Sometimes a little creativity and a whole lot of orange surveyor's tape will do the trick. The next one is a petty revenge story. I was flying solo in my early 20s, at a small airport in Europe waiting to pass through security in the very early morning. Because of the time, the line for security was not too long, maybe 20 or so people waiting. I was only traveling with a large backpack. There was only one agent serving the whole line. There was a couple queued behind me with a big rolling suitcase which they were pushing in front of them. As the line crawled forward and I took a few steps forward to close the gap, the woman pushing her suitcase rammed it into the back of my legs. At first I didn't react because accidents happen and I wasn't injured or anything, but then it happened again and again. Every time the line moved and I followed, I would get rammed by their suitcase. I was not slowing them down or in their way. I was literally just ahead of them in line. I chose to walk the path of peace and just tried my best to dodge them ramming me, at times just staring at them while they did it. They saw me reacting. They just kept doing it. I did not speak the language they did, but they were basically muttering and grumbling to each other. I'm assuming they were complaining about the wait. But Jesus hurting a random stranger won't speed things up. My best guess is they were trying to bait me into a conflict. Who knows? A few times that they hit me, I had looked up at the airport agent and made eye contact. I could tell they saw what was happening between me and these a-holes. Also, not one person in line had been pulled aside for extra screening. It was finally my turn to go through security. I walked through no problem, then got the sweet satisfaction of watching the a-holes behind me get stopped and directed into the extra full search room. In my heart, I felt like the airport agent was getting revenge for me. The next one is a malicious compliance story. About 20 years ago, I used to work for a mobile phone company, cell phones for you Americans. It was in a student town in the UK. We were the 2 CD highest selling store in the country, the top sellers being in London. We had a great team from the manager on down, around 10 of us. Could sell to anyone. If we couldn't close the sell, we would swap to another salesperson and they would have a go. Different techniques for different customers. I would get a lot of sells from the older generation just because I took the time to sit down with them and explain exactly how the phone worked, how to text, how to make a call, etc. Remember, this was 2004, no iPhone, no touchscreens. Well, around summer, we had another store cover for us as we went on a 3-day training course. They didn't tell us what it was about or anything. They put on a vid for us and it was something like, "The new and better way to sell." Audible groans were heard, and one, "We should be teaching them" comment. A lot of corporate mumbo-jumbo went on in this course. With these techniques, you will sell, sell, sell. We were told what we could say and what we couldn't say to customers. We couldn't ask someone, "How are you today?" because they could be having a bad day. Couldn't say, "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry" in the UK is a phrase that you say basically for any bad news. "It's raining." "Oh, sorry to hear that." "My goldfish died, sorry, mate." We had to read off a sheet and ask questions off that sheet. This is where the fast reading came in. A colleague of mine came up with it. Basically what he would do is read through the sheet as fast as he could. He got very good at it, and within a couple of weeks, the whole store could read that sheet from memory. Bear in mind, this wasn't a terms and conditions sheet or anything important. It was something like, 1. Greet customer using this phrase. 2. Find out why customer is in store 3. Did customer say yes 3 times? We had to fill out this form each time and attach it to the contract if we sold a phone. This guy got fast. I mean, he could do the sheet in like 5 seconds. He would basically grab a customer and just say to them, "I have to follow this sheet," and show it to the customer. Then rattle through it while the customer is looking at the sheet. He would then say to the customer something like, "Now that I've fulfilled my obligation," then go back to what would work for him normally. That sheet lasted less than 3 months. We started printing already filled out sheets to speed things up. Throughout the company, sales went down as people weren't allowed to be themselves. It was like the ways call centers are now. Run off a script. Nobody want to buy from a robot. We did Theer script, but nobody said we had to do it slow. The next one is an entitled people story. People stealing plane seats and getting told off for it are some of my favorite stories on Reddit. With the increase of plane seat bandits, most likely due to Do Airlines almost making it a requirement to pay for seats if you want to sit next to your plane partner, I have been half expecting to run into one since me and my husband travel a lot for work. Well, it finally happened and it was fun. Me and my husband always buy plane seats towards the back of the plane. As we stroll down, we see a lady with a young son, maybe 11 or 12, sitting in our seats. They were both deep in their phones when I told her she was in our seats. We had to wake up at 3 o'clock to drive to the airport, and we didn't really sleep, so I was not in the mood for bullcrap. She smiles and tells us that they weren't seated together, so the stewardess told her they could sit here. She most definitely didn't. I smile back and say we paid for these seats, so we would like to sit there. She keeps smiling her stiff smile and points to other empty seats behind us and asks if we wouldn't mind sitting in one of them since they are already settled and comfortable. Would it even matter? Well, I said, yes, since the plane is still boarding, so these might all be reserved and it really messes with the system if people sit in random seats. She is starting to lose her smile and says if there aren't seats available after the plane is finished boarding, they would move then. I am not confrontational and am usually a people pleaser, so I'm struggling to stand up for myself, but I'm so proud for doing it anyways. Meanwhile, my husband is struggling between boarding passengers to get the flight attendant. I sigh, and with a half smile say I'm sorry, but I just want to sit down and not stand in the hallway blocking people to see if maybe there are empty seats when I paid for our seats. And besides, I would like the police to be able to identify our bodies by seat number in case the plane crashes and our families want to bury our remains. The kid's face, which has been glued to his phone this entire time, shoots up in shock and he looks between me and his mom. It was delicious. She has a bewildered look on her face. There is silence for 5 seconds before she packs up her stuff and pokes her son to move. I keep smiling sweetly and thank her and plop myself down as my husband returns with a flight attendant. I tell her everything is fine and tell my husband what happened. We laughed and I'm pretty sure the mom heard, or I hope so. I didn't look back, but I think I'm not mistaken of feeling laser stare in the back of my head. Luckily, the flight was only 3 hours, so I didn't need to walk past for the loo. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.